Okay everyone, I'm going to show you how to remove the upper and lower intake manifold on a 2013 Dodge Durango. Found some stuff online for other 3.6 liter V6s. However, for the Durango, I found nothing online, and it's going to be a lot more difficult task. The reason why I'm removing the upper and possibly lower intake manifold is to get to the oil pressure sensor, which seems to be a problem on these engines. It has a tendency to fail. It may indicate that you have good oil pressure, but it'll still throw a circuit fault and a check engine light. In order to get to it, it's on the back side here of the intake manifold, underneath the lower intake manifold. It's actually part of your oil filter assembly. It's kind of hard to see down in there, but your oil filter assembly goes all the way up underneath the lower intake. It actually has the oil cooler integrated into it, and then on the back side of all that is where your oil sending unit and your oil temperature sensor is. So in order to get to it, we're going to have to remove at least the upper and possibly the lower intake as well. I'm hoping to get away with just the upper intake. There's 7 bolts securing it. Here, 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 and here. I'm going to be removing all of those as well. I've already removed, obviously, the air box, as well as the hose that runs to the throttle body. And there's going to be numerous lines in electrical connections you're going to have to disconnect as well. There was one PVC line that runs from over here all the way across into a fitting right back here. All right, that was pretty easy to get off. I also had to disconnect the mass airflow sensor plug as well. Some of the things to note on the Dodge connectors is that a lot of times they'll have a red tab on them. If you see a red tab, you're going to have to push that red tab either left or right before you can push down on the release pin. This particular one did not have it. As an example, your throttle body does. This red tab has to be slid back, and then you can push down on the button in order to release the plug. I'm sorry, can't think for a minute. So anyway, I will try to go more in depth as time goes on, but for now I'm going to get to removing them bolts. I'm not actually going to try to videotape that. Obviously, there's 7 of them. You start right here, and it just alternates back and forth to the last one, right tucked in right between the throttle body here port. So anyway, that's probably going to be the hardest one to get to. I will try to take some pictures, maybe integrate them into this as well. I'm demonstrating how to remove the upper intake manifold on a Dodge Durango 2013. This bracket here you see that's moving, that stud has to be backed out in order for this bracket to come loose. By allowing this bracket to come loose, it will pull away from the intake manifold. There's 3 brackets holding the intake manifold on. You need to remove one of them so you can back it out off of the stud right here. You're gonna have to remove 2 of them, I'm sorry. One's gonna remain because you can't get to it. The other one's right here on the back. I'll try to not block the camera view. Let me point at it with a screwdriver. The other one here on the back side, right here. I've already removed it. You can see it's loose. You can move it around. The bolt is down here. There's a clamp, and you can barely see that clamp right there, and there's the bolt, the stud again, right there where the screwdriver is. That stud has to be backed out. There's a stabilizing clamp for these hoses right here that's mounted to it. You do not need to worry about trying to remove them. You just need to get a wrench thin enough to reach in between the bracket and those support brackets and turn the stud. It'll turn with ease. It's not very difficult. It is very difficult to get to. If you have a long, thin 13 millimeter, that works best. I was able to do it with just your standard 13 millimeter wrench, standard length. It's a pain, but it only took me about 5 minutes once I decided how to do it. In order to get more access to that, these hoses right here that run to this, I disconnected all these hoses for the box and the hoses that run to this, I guess I'm guessing it's some kind of PVC system. Anyway, there's a hose that runs across here. I also disconnected that. Just trying to get myself more access without removing any hard lines. So anything that was flexible and move out of the way, I disconnected it to give myself more room back in there to try to reach that wonderful stud that you can barely see, as I pointed out earlier. Okay guys, I want to update you. I've actually got the intake off and I just set it back up there kind of to give you an idea of what I had to do in order to get this off. Sorry about the thumb there. Don't claim to be a professional. Anyway, once you get the intake off, one of the things you're going to have to do is there's numerous bolts. There's 7 bolts total that you're going to have to remove. I'm just going to show you more detail on the ground how to remove them, but for the moment I just wanted to place it up here. Once you remove all 7 of these bolts, what you're going to have to do is then lift and slide the intake over to the driver's side just slightly. And the reason for that is that there's 2 studs on the back, I'll show you more clearly in a minute, that have to clear a bracket. That bracket, there's no access to the bolts, so you can't loosen it up loosen the brackets up so they fall away from the studs like we did on the driver's side. So once we do that, we're going to lift it up. Now we've gotten it free. Then the next thing we're going to do is rotate it towards the passenger side. That's going to allow you to get to all these hoses. I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way now, and it's going to allow you to get to these hoses. There's several hoses here. These hoses here. Let me get my screwdriver. Here we go. We'll point it out with this. You got several hoses here. This one here, as well as this one. Both of them are much easier to get to once you've rotated that intake to the passenger side so that you can then twist them off with a pair of pliers. Next thing you want to make sure you've done prior to actually removing it is disconnecting all this harness, your different plugs. Remember, these plugs have the red tab that has to be slid back before you can then depress and pull it off. If you depress on the button and try to pull it off and it doesn't come off easily, you do not have the red tab far enough back. Every one of these came off with ease. The other thing you're going to have to do is break all these harnesses away from the intake manifold. They have these little snap clips. There's 2 of them total. They pop off very easily. So again, also remember, along with them 7 bolts, I'm going to show you them 7 bolts. You got this bracket here. Studs go in each position here, and you have to take both them nuts off. The first one you can see pretty easy. This second one, you can't see it very easily. I broke it free with a 2-inch extension and a socket on a 1/4-inch drive ratchet, and then I spun it off by hand. Very easy to lose that particular bolt there for sure. Again, I want to remind you about these brackets. These are the brackets that I told you about earlier in the previous video, and you have to back these off so they're loose. All right, we're going to come over here to the intake now and show you all the bolts and stuff. You got 7 bolts total. They're all 8 millimeters. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this 7th one, I really want to show you the 7th one. That's the most difficult one. It looks easy from here. However, it's right up against the firewall, and so it makes it very difficult to get to. I had to use a 2-inch extension in order to get to it, and it still was a bear. I ended up using a mirror to be able to actually put the socket onto the bolt. You thought you would be able to feel for it and it would work, but if you notice, it's kind of down in there and there's a ledge, and it just didn't work that way for me at all. I ended up having to use a mirror. Other thing I want to point out again is these hoses. You got the hose here and the hose here. Them are the 2 hoses that we had to disconnect. Remember, just rotate the intake counterclockwise once you break it free to break them loose. These are the 2 studs for that bracket. You want to make sure that both them studs, that's all I need to do is drop it and break it, right? You want to make sure that both them studs clear the bracket. Again, that's the bracket that you cannot break free, so therefore you just have to take the nuts off and then pull away from the bracket. Then here on the front, I actually have both nuts screwed onto the one stud here. Here's the other stud. Them are the 2 brackets that after you take the bolts off, the nuts off, you're then going to have to go to the lower part of the bracket and loosen the studs on it so that the brackets will actually fall away from this. They need to fall away again so you can move the intake manifold towards the driver's side to free yourself from these 2 studs over here. If you don't loosen up any of the brackets, I promise you, you're not getting that intake off. It is locked in place with just them 4 studs. So just something to think about. Good luck on the upper intake manifold. It was a bear. Where I ended up spending about 4 hours on this task. It's not really that long a task once you understand what needs to happen. But without any prior knowledge, and I couldn't find any videos on it, so that's why I decided to make this one, it became a very difficult task. Okay, now that we got the upper intake off, I wanted to show you the lower intake. I've already taken the bolts loose, but the lower intake's a lot easier. The big thing you do is you got to get all these bolts loose here. They're all 8 millimeters. There's a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes, 9 total. The hardest one to get to is back here in the very back. I don't know if you can see that. There it is right there. That's the hardest one to get to. Also want to point out these 2 wiring harnesses right here. Both of them had clamps on them, little plastic zip tie type clamps that also had one of them push to lock plugs that mounted to the back of the lower intake manifold. I just cut them off. That seemed to be the easiest way rather than try to pull them. There's not a lot of room back there, and so cutting them off seemed to be the thing to do. Doesn't really seem to be any need for the clamps. There's not any chance of chafing. The harness really won't move close to anything to chafe. It looks like it was more there, if anything, just to secure it during installation. Also, your fuel line, which is right here, you're going to need to disconnect that as well. Obviously, you can see it's already disconnected. That fuel line has a couple different clips. I'll show you them clips a little bit later, but it's a double clip. You have to remove a blue clip first and then a white clip. You need to be very careful. It's very easy to break the white clip if you're not careful. Also, on this, the lower intake, you're going to need to disconnect all of the fuel injectors, and they're held in with these lock tabs as well. The harness is. I popped them off. I didn't have to cut them. Them seem to be in such a location that chafing could be a problem, so I went ahead and tried to pull them out. It was difficult, but if you have the right tool, they come out pretty easily. Your fuel injector connector, one of the things you want to note is it has a double locking feature too. You have to pull this red tab up. It's normally in a down position. You have to pop it up, and then that way you can push the button to actually release the injector. If you have the red button pulled up far enough, unplug fairly easily. However, if it's not all the way up and you're having to tug and yank on it, I don't recommend that. It's easy to break them. Okay, I think that's pretty much it for the lower intake. It's not too big a deal. It's pretty easy, like I said. So, anyway. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the fuel line removal again. It's right here. It connects right here. You want to make sure that you bleed off the fuel pressure. The way to do that, according to Dodge, is to pull the fuel relay and then crank the engine over several times. These engines operate at about 50 psi of fuel pressure, so that can be a lot of pressure. You want to cover it with a rag, even if you do that. I didn't bleed the pressure off. I just disconnected it and caught the fuel with a rag. It wasn't too bad. If you do want to disconnect the fuel relay on a 2013 Dodge, I'm not sure exactly when they changed it, but Dodge had quite a few problems with the fuel relays failing. It's actually integrated into the PCU. So what they did was once you have the recall done, they install relay right here on the firewall. So it's a lot easier to get to that way as well. So it worked out for me anyhow. Okay, the lower intake is off. Now we got access to the oil filter assembly, which includes the oil filter, the oil cooler, as well as your oil temperature sensor. And then I don't know if you can see it down there, but right here is your oil pressure sensor. Kind of a unique deal with these plugs again. This one here has this red tab. Don't know if you can see it without blocking it. This red tab has to be up. If this red tab's not up, you cannot push in on the, there you go, like so. Then you push in on the plug and it should come right off. There you go. Then now you can see the plug for your actual oil pressure sensor. That's usually the one that's the problem. A lot of times there's leaks as well. If you see a bunch of excess oil down in here, it's a good possibility that your oil filter housing is leaking. If that's the case, it's recommended you replace the whole thing. Don't try to replace bits and pieces. However, do remember that part of the oil that could be down in there is from oil spillage. When someone removes the oil filter, if they don't allow it to drain and they allow it to drip all in there. So unless you have an excessive oil leaking problem, just because you see oil down here, don't assume you have an oil leak. All right, I left the oil temperature sensor in as I removed the oil pressure sensor, which is right here. I left it in. All I used was a crescent wrench. Looks like you're going to need like a 26 millimeter or a 1 1/16 might work deep well socket. If you have the right tool, it will fit over there. They have to be hollowed out because obviously this connection is pretty thick. I'll go ahead and show you the actual one that I've already replaced it. This is the one I removed. I didn't have the correct deep well socket. That would have made it go a lot faster. With the crescent wrench, it took me about 10 minutes just to get this out because all I could get on it was 1/8 of a turn at a time, and I had to keep flipping the wrench from one direction to the other each time, you know, flipping it back and forth in order for it to work. So anyway, took me about 10 minutes to get this off versus maybe 2 minutes max had I had the correct socket wrench. Let's go ahead and go over here and see if I can determine what size it is. I have several different wrenches over here. I might have one that's big enough. I'm going to be kind of upset if I find one that works. Okay, that one's not going to work. Too big. Let's see what else we got here. I'm pretty sure it's bigger than 1 inch. Yes, it is bigger than 1 inch. Right there, there we go. You know, good old American cars, they have standard and metric sizes. Well, it looks like I was right. 1 1/16 seems to be the correct size for the OEM version. I'm not sure if that's going to work on the aftermarket version or not. Let's go over here and see if we can get a wrench on it and see. And yeah, it looks like that would work as well. The wrench may have worked a little bit better than the crescent wrench that I used, just simply because it's not quite as bulky, but at any rate, you get the idea. So again, that took about 10 minutes to replace, but the fact that I couldn't find nothing on the internet about how to remove the upper and lower intake on a Dodge Durango, I found plenty of stuff on front wheel drive cars. There's a lot of things that are the same, but there is some things that are different. So it took me about 4 hours to get to a 10-minute job and a $40 part. Okay, I just wanted to do a little closing video on the install and removal of the upper and lower intake and the oil pressure sensor for the 2013 Dodge Durango. This task overall took me about 6 hours total. At least half that time was just me figuring out what the correct procedure was for breaking loose certain things, like the driver's side brackets, the 2 brackets on this side, and then understanding that them hard lines didn't have to be moved at all. You could just fit a wrench down in there and loosen up the stud for the lower part of the bracket, even though the hard line clamp was still on there. What actually retains that clamp is nothing but a little snap type washer that just presses on and it bites into the threads of the stud and holds that clamp in place for the hard lines. So therefore it's not really something you can back off. Other than that, wasn't any real big problems. One of the other things I do want to note is, hopefully I'm going to be doing this right, is that all your bolts for your upper and lower intakes, when you raise them up and screw them out, make sure that they clear the intake manifold, the bottom surface of it. That way when you're trying to lift the intake out, you can do that fairly easy. They like to get caught on things. That's something that I learned. You can actually remove them, but that's not really necessary. If you just keep turning them, they'll raise up and they'll actually lock into the intake somewhat, and that way you can don't have to keep track of them. You know exactly where to go, because there is one or two that are a different length, but they're not out of the way. If they're hanging below the bottom of the flat surface that the intake manifold mounts to, they can catch on things as you're trying to reinstall it. And if you can see, there's not a lot of clearance right here, so it pretty much goes on almost flat with the lower intake manifold. Same deal with the lower intake manifold. You want all them bolts up out of the way as you're installing it. That way you don't scratch the aluminum surface that you're trying to get a good seal to. You scratch that surface with them bolts, there's a possibility that your seals won't make a good seal, and you could have a small vacuum leak. So just something else to think about. Other than that, I don't think there was too much problems. I did remove, I don't think I showed you in the video, but I did remove the upper air box as well as this hose. It wasn't shown in the video, but that's not a big deal. But other than that, it was pretty much a piece of cake. There is some other videos out there on removing the upper and lower intake. I suggest that you look at them. I believe one of the guys is MotorCity Mopar or something like that. That guy does a real good job of illustrating what to do. Better job than me for sure. I'll get his link and include the link in the video or in the comments section below. That way you can watch his video. His video is very detailed, as well as he gives you the torque specs for the intake. Off the top of my head, I'll try to include that in the video. But the upper intake, the bolts are torqued to 89 inch-pounds. Remember, that's inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. We're dealing with plastic, so you want to make sure you don't over-torque these. The lower intake is 106 inch-pounds. A little bit different because you're screwing into aluminum instead of plastic to plastic. So them are really the only two torque specs that you'll need. As far as I can remember, that's all I remember using. The throttle body, I removed the throttle body so that I could get access to the back, to the studs and the electrical connection that was there. It's not really necessary, but it was just easy for me. And that also gets torqued to 89 inch-pounds. So, hope you guys find this informative, and I hope it works out. It turns out to be something that is useful to you, because I sure had a hard time finding anything that was helpful to me. Thanks for watching.